Hello people. I wanted to discuss a little bit in this video about wording. Wording that is often used in geopolitical situations. The wording is world wars. World war. Think about that for a second. Some cigars, by the way, I got in the Netherlands. I'm not generally a smoker, but on and off, just in case you're wondering. I think that this is something that is worth exploring a little bit because, by the way, I'm referring, if you hadn't worked out, to the situation in the Crimea and the very serious circumstances around that. Russia, as you will know unless you've been to the moon, has annexed the Crimea and essentially, to all effective purposes, part of Russia now. Culturally, the Russians would say it always has been. It's majority Russian speaking and so on and so on. I'm not going to go into details about the specific circumstances of the Crimean situation, although it's undoubtedly very serious, and it's certainly pitching Moscow against the West in a very profound way. There was a big international security summit yesterday in The Hague. I was actually travelling through the Netherlands at the time, and there was no major disruption, but there was leaders at Schiphol Airport a few hours before I was there myself. It was a security meeting, but inevitably the Crimea was brought up. I think what's brought me to talk about this is that there's been a few analogies with the fact that in the 1930s Hitler annexed the Sudetenland in the context that he was protecting German speakers. Now Putin is doing the same thing with the Crimea in the sense that he's protecting Russian speakers. I think it was Hillary Clinton actually went as far as to compare Putin to Hitler. I think it's always slightly risky comparing historic figures, but nevertheless I think Putin is a very determined man. Is he Adolf Hitler? No, of course not. But there's no doubt about it, this is probably the most tense situation since the end of the Cold War. But in terms of World War analogies, that's something we need to be cautious about. It seems to me that whenever there's a major international crisis, which happens roughly once a year in some way or another, then talk of World War comes about. I mean, if you look at the situation last year, the year before, it was tension in the South China Sea. That's momentarily been put on the side because of this Malaysia Airlines search, although that certainly brought about tensions between Beijing and Kuala Lumpur. But the East Asia region right now it's been tense for years, and with a hawkish Japanese Prime Minister in Shinzo Abe and a new Chinese doctrine of, not new, but let's say advanced Chinese doctrine of nationalism under Xi Jinping, and securing interests, for example this Chinese security zone that's been brought about, then certainly that's another part of the world that's very tense. So right now those are the two main regions, East Asia and the Crimea, Ukraine, Russia. A few years ago I would have included Iran in that, with the tensions with the West, but the new leadership of Iran has taken a more moderate approach, and Obama's taken a more moderate approach than Bush, arguably. Some Republicans are comparing Barack Obama to Neville Chamberlain, being an appeasement. Now, the insinuation there is clear that we are looking at a potential world war situation. But I think, it's important not to overuse this terminology because A, it can be scaremongering, and B, world wars are a specific thing with specific definitions. At the moment I would describe this as a major geopolitical situation, certainly not a world war situation. So how do we define a world war? There's no actual concrete definition for what a world war is. To the popular imagination, there's been two world wars. The first, 1914 to 1918, the second, 1939 to 1945. And that arguably began a little earlier with the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. But roughly speaking, 14 to 18 and 39 to 45 are the two world wars. Now, it was actually Churchill, Winston Churchill, who coined the term World War, I believe, and he actually argued that the 7 Years' War was the first truly global conflict, in the sense that all the great European powers of the time were involved, and it was on several continents. There was battles fought in North America, in Europe, and in Asia, in the Indian subcontinent, over that conflict. So in that sense, the 7 Years' War between 1757 and 1764, apologies if I've got those dates slightly wrong, but 7 Years' War was the first global conflict. Certainly it was a bloody conflict. Estimates are well over 1 million dead, so it was a major conflict, but whether it can truly be classed as a world war is a contentious issue, because there wasn't the sort of mass drafting that we saw in both world wars, and military men weren't mobilised in the same way. And realistically, would the news of the 7 Years' War have hit home in the way that the First and Second World War did? You know, really, would people in cities around Britain have been speaking about it in the way that... What I'm trying to get at, would it have had the sort of cultural impact on civilian populations outside the war zone as it did with the world wars? I'm not so sure about that. Churchill then argued that the Napoleonic Wars, the French Revolutionary Wars, collectively they're sometimes known as the Great French War, was the Second World War, the second global conflict, for the same rationale. That it was a major conflict, it was fought over several continents, and all the major European powers were involved. Certainly the Napoleonic Wars was a major affair, up to 6 million fatalities in that conflict. But is it really a world war? Sort of from the period 1750 onwards, pretty much every significant global conflict, or significant conflict I should say, had several countries involved in one way or another, even as mercenaries or volunteers, or in one form or another. But in the popular imagination, World War I is a specific event from 14 to 18. Some would say the Cold War was the Third World War. Others have said the War on Terror is the Third World War, or the Fourth World War. This is the point I'm making. These terms are thrown around a lot. I don't class the War on Terror as a world war, even though there was fighting from a very widespread field, so to speak, everywhere from basically North Africa, Algeria, to the Philippines has had some role in the War on Terror, which of course is a controversial term. Collectively though, those conflicts add up to maybe, at the very most, 2 million fatalities, so it's minuscule compared to World War II. And that's not to trivialise, a conflict like Iraq, which is very bloody, but I do think it's important to really look at these terminology. I mean, there's been much bigger civil wars than, for example, the War on Terror. Take, for instance, the Russian Civil War, up to 10 million fatalities or more. It was almost as deadly as World War I itself, but it's simply known as the Russian Civil War. It's not classed as a global conflict. So, my question is what we are looking at a possible future world war, or are we seeing scaremongering from the media? I don't think it's scaremongering. I do think this is a genuinely serious situation because of the implications that are going on, and I don't think Putin's going to stop with the Crimea. Only today in Time magazine I read that Mikhail Gorbachev, of all people, has said that the whole of South Ukraine in theory should be in Russian hands, so I see nothing to stop Putin trying that. European countries aren't going to boycott Russia because they rely on gas, so this is going to be a stalemate situation. But the very fact people are comparing Western leaders to Neville Chamberlain, who of course is history's great appeaser, by the way, a man who's actually quite complex premiership, because people forget Chamberlain was immensely popular when he came back from Munich, but he was just wrong, as history showed. Now, I really don't think that Putin is Hitler, but I do think he is not, for want of a better term, a normal leader. And I do think he's a very ruthless man. I think Putin is the sort of man who has a fixed goal and will do his level best to get what he wants. He's also immensely powerful. In that sense, there may be Hitler analogies. The problem is, with Putinism, there isn't necessarily this Aryan ethnic sort of extreme Teutonic ideology, fascist ideology. I'm not sure if it's accurate to call Putin a fascist. An autocrat, certainly, a dictator perhaps, but I don't know about fascist. Russia has racism problems, and I think certainly Putin's been stirring up Russian nationalism in the region, which is always dangerous, always dangerous. But comparing Putin to Adolf Hitler is a bit... I think it's risky. It's risky because it sets a precedent of language that might not be helpful. The reason I think this is a serious situation, though, is I see no way of this de-escalating. Russia's not going to pull its troops back. Ukraine's felt humiliated. The best outcome now would be for the Ukrainians to just accept what has happened, which would be very bitter for them, because they've seen it as an invasion of their sovereignty. I mean, let's not forget it was a Russian leader, Nikita Khrushchev, that basically handed over Crimea in the first place. So the nationalism here is definitely something that's potentially dangerous. I believe nationalism is always dangerous, and you see this in East Asia as well. There's sometimes very intense nationalism in that region. Russia's a nuclear power. It's a major power, and it's led by a very determined man. So in that sense, who by the way is currently enjoying very high approval ratings, taking all those things on board, there's nothing to suggest that Putin would stop here. So it is quite a dangerous situation. World war, not yet, no. And it may not come to that. Having said that, I've mentioned how we have a risk here of scaremongering and overusing the terminology. Having said that, I think it would be equally naive to be complacent and believe that it would never happen again. After World War I, people thought it would never happen again. So the idea that it's impossible, the idea that the world's more stable than ever before, or something like that, is sort of missing the point. I made a video recently about how the world is less violent than is often portrayed, and I stand by that. I still think the world's a lot less violent than it was in, say, the 70s. But history does repeat itself, and there's nothing to suggest that there couldn't be serious implications of what is happening in Ukraine, I should say in Ukraine proper, because I understood recently, I hadn't realised this, but the Ukraine apparently is a derogatory term in the eyes of many Ukrainians. They see it as that being the Russian terminology for a far off region, so apologies to any Ukrainians watching for that slip of the tongue. I think to be classified as a world war, probably the definition would be that every major power is involved. That would be all the G8 countries, all the major economies involved, and nowadays, much more so than World War II, would be Brazil, India, and India involved as well, and China. China is definitely a country to watch, not necessarily as an aggressor, but as a power broker, as a negotiator, as a middleman, that sort of thing. So World War, not yet, but I don't think Russia's going to take kindly to the sort of snubs that it's receiving. Not the G8 necessarily, but other issues. You know, humanity has shown itself to be incredibly stupid and not learn its mistakes from the past. So there's nothing to suggest that history won't repeat itself. I hope it doesn't, because a real world war would be millions of lives, but at the same time it's naive to think that the circumstances are not impossible. I mean, are impossible for it to happen again. It's true that Europe's united, but it may not necessarily be a conflict between European countries. At any point in the Cold War there is potential moments. We know of the Cuban Missile Crisis, We know of the standoff in 1983, which is less documented but still very serious. I do believe that with Putin in the Kremlin, things have got a lot more serious than they were in the immediate post-Cold War years. I think Dmitry Medvedev will be a lot more moderate. But anyway, these are just thoughts being put out there. Let me know what you think. Is the terminology of World War overused? Is it possible that it could happen again? Do you think there's any flashpoint areas? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you.